Child sexual abuse is very commonly committed by women, but it's a taboo subject in our society. We much prefer to shout about male perverts and kiddie fiddlers, paedophiles and internet grooming. It's a comfort to us that our children are always safe in the hands of women. That's why priests come under easy fire for child abuse, for example, but never nuns, even though nuns have far greater access to children than priests. So is there such a thing as a female paedophile?
Oh yes. Now, female paedophiles, there's a great deal of controversy about this. In fact, when I brought up the issue that women could sexually abuse children, I was vilified. I was cast out of the sisterhood. I was no longer a good feminist because sexual abuse had to be under the guise of male power. And if I had a significant number of women who were sexually abusing children and I knew about these women, then that messed up the male power thing. And surely if women were going to abuse children, then they had to be doing it under the thumb of a man. A man had to be telling them to do it. They've been able to disguise their abuse, I think, more cleverly than men have. And society doesn't want to believe that there are female abusers. It's easier to think it's a nasty man. I was one really sad man who rang me up, who was he had custody of his 12-year-old daughter, and she told him that her mother had abused her. He took her to social services. It wasn't a court case, it was after the court had decided he was going to be the father. He was going to be the custodial father. Took it to social services, and they accused him. They wouldn't let him leave. They threatened to take the daughter into care. He said, he wrote a letter, a very poignant letter, which I still have, where he said, if I'd been a woman walking in there and saying that my husband sexually abused my daughter, he said, I would have been given cups of tea, I would have been talked to, I would have been taken seriously, but because I was a man doing this, I wasn't taken seriously. I do know, for example, at rape crisis centers, when I was trying to find places for men who'd been abused by women to talk, it was okay for women who'd been abused by women to call rape crisis center. They would talk to them, but they would not talk to men who had been sexually abused by women. And that hasn't changed a whole lot. There's still very few places for male adult survivors to go to get help if they've been abused by a man or a woman.
One argument against even the idea of female paedophiles is that women don't have penises, and so can't really do anything too serious.
Women tend to use objects, broom handles, bottles. One woman said that she was sexually abused by rose stems with the thorns still on, being stuck up. Women can be quite cruel using objects, but they're still after their own sexual gratification. So it's kind of, you know, that it's just actually, it's just a physiological thing, the difference.
Women have sex with these children, but this paedophilia doesn't exist according to the NSPCC and our media. The link between those that have been abused and then go on to abuse, is that the same whether the victims are male or female?
It does seem to be, the women that I know who have sexually abused children do seem to have been abused in their childhood. I talked to one of them who said, oh, I just want to have sex with kids because sex with children is beautiful. It's non-threatening. It's what happened to me when I was a child. So I think that the link of adult female abusers with abuse in their childhood is the same as a link with adult male abusers. In other words, most of them have been abused as children in some really dramatic way. I'd written several books about how it was men who sexually abused, and maybe only 5% of abusers ever would be women. And I remember a summer radio time program. You know, in the summer, they're desperate for something to talk about, and everybody's out of town anyway, so this one presenter rang me up and he said, come on and talk to me about any cases of female sexual abuse you might have. Well, at that point, I only had maybe 10 or 11 or 12, I can't remember. So I went on this program and I talked about women abusing, and it opened up a floodgate. We had tons of telephone calls into the program from adults who thought they were the only ones. And then by the time I got back to my office, we had even more. And it kind of was a snowball effect. It was like when we first started talking about sexual abuse at all, when the adults would say, I never knew it happened to anybody else. I didn't know that, my dad or my uncle or somebody abused me. I didn't know anybody else did this. Same thing was happening with women. It was men and women ringing, saying, I was abused by my mother, by my aunt, by a nun, by a teacher, by, all kinds of different people. I was shocked. I don't expect women to sexually abuse. I really, really thought it was a tiny, tiny problem. At one point after This Morning program, ages ago, and again in the 90s, we talked about it on that program, and they had 1,000 phone calls. They had 1,000 phone calls in one day. They couldn't even cope with them all. And that happened, and the reason I say that is because that was morning television from people who happened to be listening, who managed to call in. The 800 cases I've got, I'm just one person. And we're not a big organization. We don't have a huge profile. These are the people who've managed to get to me. Therefore, I think that there are a lot more out there. We had a conference about this eventually in, I think, 94, maybe earlier. 400 people applied to come to this conference. It was a huge conference. But 30 people, between 20 and 30 people came, dotted themselves in the audience, and tried to disrupt it. They were yelling that, why was I paying attention to women? It wasn't women. I was taking the attention away from men. One of the women who was going to talk about her own abuse, who was now helping others, then couldn't face the audience. So you had this uproar. You had people in the audience turning on these women who were standing up saying, sit down, we want to hear about this. And you had them shouting, and it was absolutely strange. And very sad, because it was like, don't tell me this information, even if it's true, because I don't want to hear it. And if those women who came along to our conference had had anything to do about it, nobody else would have ever talked about it. It would have just gone away.
One justification used for female paedophiles is the co-offending theory. That is, they acted as a result of male coercion. Do women tend to only commit child abuse if there's a man involved as well?
No, no. In over 75% of the cases, the women acted completely alone. Most times there wasn't even a man in the premises. So, the excuse, and it's interesting about us as women, because we're quite willing to accept that we are a superior breed and that we do everything right, but quite unwilling to accept that we could do anything quite as horrible as this. So it's really not us.
I know there are plenty of women who commit paedophilia, and they get away with it because of the mother expectation, because of the image that they can use of the motherly type. So a woman can go to a schoolyard quite happily and watch the children go by, but if a man does, there's something perverted going on there, and that's how a lot of older female paedophiles get away with it and continue to get away with it, and they will do, because we're letting them. If we think about women and men in that way, then we're making it easier for them to.
The same brush has been used to paint all men. Watch out for men. It's a bad message for men, it's a bad message for kids, and it's an untrue message, and it's statistically not sound.
Sexual abuse by women has the same foundation as that committed by men. They've generally experienced childhood abuse themselves. Women are not immune from turning into abusers, as we like to think. By pretending that female paedophiles don't exist, we have little protection from them.
Yeah, women who sexually abuse children like to have jobs where they're around children. Nursing, teaching, daycare, things like that. You really don't think twice I mean, most parents don't think twice about leaving their children in care of a woman. They do now think twice about leaving their child in care of a man. Again, I think that that's wrong. But there you are, that's what's happening. So they will find jobs where they can get in contact. It's like an alcoholic in a bar. Yeah, if you can possibly, if you've got an addiction, and this is an addiction, then you will go to some place that you can actually practice your addiction. And any place around kids is a good place. Women and men who have been sexually abused by their mothers are some of the most damaged people that I've ever met. The vast majority of the people who have contacted me have told me that it was their mother who sexually abused them. Now, I wouldn't like to say that that's what's happening necessarily with child sexual abuse everywhere by women. But the mother can disguise what she's doing, putting cream on the child, bathing the child, holding the child in bed. You know, society thinks, ooh, that's okay, because it's a mommy. Maybe it's a bit suspect because it's a dad, which I think is very sad, but that's how it goes. I think most female sexual abuse goes undetected, and in fact, I think that a lot of people cover up for their mothers. It's very rarely talked about. There are only 2 or 3 books even out there about the subject, so that unless there's a media coverage of it, for example, somebody writes a personal book or goes on and tells a personal story, or a film comes out, then that brings a flurry of people who say, oh, okay, I'll tell. But I think for the most part it's quite quiet. I mean, when's the last time you heard about female sexual abuse of children?
I mean, my son, when we separated, he was 4, and he was obviously, you know, he was disturbed about what was going on between his parents. He wanted to be in my bed, and I thought about the implications of it, and then, like you, I thought, fuck it, no, he can stay there, that's fine, and we'll take the consequences if someone raises an issue about it, which luckily they never did. But you have to say to people who come to our meetings, be careful, you know, because there'll be suggestions.
With female sexual abuse of children, it's often termed seduction and not abuse. In most cases, it's actually presented as either harmless or even a good thing.
It comes down to perception. For instance, men are the sexual predators and women are not, which means that women can get away with child abuse a lot easier than men can, and they do.
When 28-year-old Deborah LaFay fucks that kid, that's a crime we didn't get it on videotape. Wow, that's... That kid is not traumatized for life. I should have been so traumatized for life, so scarred.
Whilst I agree that we need to get a grip in society concerning hysteria about abuse, does this really make sense? Do boys simply not need protection from adult women and their sexual desires?
There isn't a charge of rape for a woman.
Really? There isn't?
No. I think
because there's that thing in the teachers. There was a teacher that had sex with underage boys, and that went to court, but I don't know what happened to it.
I think it's called indecent assault. I mean, it might have changed this May. Recently there's been some changes to try and get rid of discrimination of this type, but before May, there's no such thing as a woman raping anybody.
Blimey. It's unusual, isn't it? It's the same it's the same difference, isn't it, really?
Women who sexually abuse kids, if you look in the media, have affairs with them. They seduce them. The victims, if they're boys, are always described as older than their age. They look bigger. The woman who ran off, I've forgotten her name, she ran off about 2 years ago to Florida with a 14-year-old boy. She was his teacher, I think she was 30-something. This was described as an affair. And my comment was, if that had been a 31-year-old man who'd run off with a 13 or 14-year-old girl, would we have described it as an affair? No, I don't think so. We excuse women. We don't want to believe it. And as Germaine Greer said to me on a television program, well, if it is a woman having sex with a young teenage boy, i.e. a 13 or 14-year-old, and he gets an erection, then clearly it's his responsibility. And I'm going, excuse me? This is not logical. So it seems that the boy, if it's a boy, the boy is blamed in any event. If it's a girl, then it's kind of, ooh, you know, ooh, that must be, she must be a lesbian. It must be something like that. It must be a lesbian affair. It's abuse. I'm sorry. It's abuse if the child is under the age of 16. The law states it's abuse, and it doesn't matter whether it's a man or woman. Now, the most recent law that came out on May 1st actually now does say gender is irrelevant. Finally.
So you don't accept the argument that if a boy has an erection, then he must want it? He must want the abuse?
There is no correlation between a boy having an erection and wanting sex, just as there's no correlation with a girl having an orgasm and having sex with an abuser. Children's bodies respond to sexual stimuli. Their minds, their development, their beings are not ready for it. What people do forget is that sexual abuse can feel good if it's not violent and nasty. I mean, you see my kids, when they were tiny, when they were like 7, 8, 9 months old, you go in and you find them with their hands inside their nappies asleep at night. The same with girls. So there's a sexuality that children have. But when that is hothoused, when it's forced, when the development is at the behest of the abuser and not at the natural developmental level of the child, then that's abuse.
If a woman has sex with an underage boy, do you regard that as rape?
Yes, absolutely. When you talk to these boys who have these affairs, and I put that in quotes because it's abuse, with older women, at the time of the affair, they're usually confused. They've usually been told having sex is a good thing. And other people would say, oh, you lucky boy. You know, oh, you've had sex with an older woman. Boy, I wish I was that. When you talk to them 10 years later, and they look back on it, it in many ways destroyed their lives. One man said to me, in fact, he's in the book, I did a program with him, and he said, I should have been out kicking footballs with my friends. I should have been dating girls. I should have been concentrating on my schoolwork. He said, and all I could think about was the next time I was going to have sex with my teacher. And he said, I wasn't ready for it. She was pushing it. And I thought it was cool. But it wasn't. It was abuse. And I think that really does hold true. I have only ever met one man who said that he thought it was great and it continued to be great, and he was still having sex at age 40 with his mother in her 60s and his sister.
Why can we no longer think of the British Isles without the word paedof in front of them?
Our society has become increasingly paranoid about child safety, imagining abuse behind every closed door and a paedophile in every playground.
These are our children. They skip down our streets, but the paedophile is waiting.
As with terrorism, child sexual abuse dominates our news coverage, when the actual prevalence of such abuse is so low that such heavy coverage doesn't make sense.
Government plans paedophile hostels in neighbourhoods across the country, but will residents tolerate them?
It's being claimed that children are still at risk from paedophiles because of a major shortfall in funding the policing of the internet. The Association of Chief Police Officers and a coalition of leading charities want a massive injection of money to help catch offenders.
There are warnings tonight that some of the children who've been orphaned by the tsunami disaster could become victims of abuse.
Orphanages are preparing themselves for a huge influx of children, but aid agencies are warning that paedophiles could try to exploit them.
Men are maligned on our screens. Every other TV show has a reference to male paedophiles and abusers.
Now you look like the sort who's got some beautiful kiddies at home.
What do you want to know for? What are you? Some sort of paediatrician or something? You need locking up, you do.
In swimming pools and at school plays, photographs are forbidden, in the pretense that it's for child safety. The real reason is to keep horrible thoughts of paedophiles at the front of our minds, where such thoughts are simply not warranted. One school in England will only publish pictures of students with faces censored.
I'm actually very distressed by what has happened about sexual abuse of children in general. And my main distress is the kind of vilification of men. There was a study which came out from one of the polytechs that became a university, And the study said that most men could become sexual abusers. And I spoke out against that on the media very, very strongly because I was furious. You know, I'm raising 2 sons. What is the message to young men? That you're a danger to your own children?
But what can be done to address that? I mean,
we have to speak out. And it's not a popular thing to do, but whenever anybody makes one of these absolutely ludicrous statements, it's very important that people stand up and say, excuse me, prove that. You know, what is this? You know, like this university saying that all men have the potential to be abusers. That's like saying we all have the potential to be murderers. I mean, I suppose we all have the potential to be all kinds of things.
It's kind of nonsensical because, yeah, every man is capable of rape. To then accuse the man of being a rapist or of being a potential rapist because he can do is ridiculous. Young babies, the most vulnerable of society that we can imagine. The murder of young babies are almost entirely by their mothers. Young babies don't tend to get murdered very often, but almost entirely the murder of young babies are by their mother. So therefore, every mother, every woman is potentially a baby killer. It's in the same way, you know, it means nothing.
By and large, 99.9% of the people actually outside are okay. So you don't want to instill into a generation of youngsters the fact that, you know, outside people are full of weirdos who are likely to be molesting and upsetting and harming you. But you've got to actually ensure that alongside that 99%, you've got 1% of the population who are the ones who are likely to cause you danger and risk. I mean, they've always been there. We mustn't disguise ourselves and say, oh, this is only just a new issue. There's always been the issue of child abuse and so on and so forth. But now we live in an age where it's even more so, and I think it's more high profile.
Edicts are coming out from councils telling teachers not to touch children between the shoulders and the knees, not to let them sit on your lap if you're reading them a story. And this is, although it says it's aimed at men and women, it's aimed at men.
There's national guidelines, there's guidelines from the DFE. The local education authority issues very clear guidelines, and the school actually has clear guidelines. We stand the risk of allegations being made against us, and so you need to be scrupulously clear. You don't put yourself in a situation where you could be compromised or there's a misunderstanding. So, for example, my office door is never shut. If I'm dealing with a child, talking to a child, unless it's with a parent present or another member of staff, the door's always open.
This paranoia about child sexual abuse is no accident. It's a deliberate plan executed by government and charities to generate income out of our fears.
The NSPCC and other feminist groups promote the view that men are the main abusers of children in their fundraising campaigns. But it's not true that men are more abusive than women. The NSPCC's own figures show that women commit most acts of child abuse, even allowing for their greater custody of children.
Most child abuse is committed by single or unmarried women. A child's health prospects dramatically deteriorate when there's no father in the household.
Is there any relation between child sexual abuse by mothers and whether they're in single-parent families or normal, stable families?
What I have found is that the vast majority were women alone. If they did have partners or husbands, the partners were either away a lot or were quite weak. Doesn't mean, we have to be careful there too, because it doesn't mean that single parent families are bad. It's just that I cannot disguise the fact that the vast majority of this abuse has happened where there has only been, when it's been mother abuse, when there's only been a mother in the home.
As I say, I stayed for as long as I did because I felt that if I wasn't there, she would take it out on them. The reason for believing that is that my wife was abused as a child. Her father left when she was 8. He was abused by his wife. He was told that the children would be safe if he went. He needed to go, otherwise he'd have a nervous breakdown. And the children would be safe, but they weren't. As soon as he'd gone, she started on them.
Most people, men and women, have their first ever experience of violence at the hands of their mothers.
Mama, I didn't mean to break it, I'm sorry. Oh, you're behind, gonna be sorry.
I think my mother's the only woman that hasn't hurt me, actually. Well, she physically beat me, but, you know, that's...
Yeah, well, same here.
Yeah, but that's okay.
That's cultural. I was beaten until my head was bleeding. I mean, Jesus, I was
you seem okay
beaten
now.
damn hard.
But then again...
Well, that's only on the surface. And I would never do that to my children because I experienced it.
What I tell you about mine? Get upstairs now!
You didn't have to hit your boy like that. He's already scared to death.
I appreciate you helping my Eddie, I truly do. But I'll have nobody question how I raised him, not even his daddy.
Yet the presentation of child abuse overwhelmingly singles out men as perpetrators.
I mean, you knew a bigger no than the last time I decked you.
This is particularly true with the presentation of child sexual abuse.
Lisa, do you know why you're here?
Yes.
Can you tell us?
Because Daddy touched me in bad places.
Burying your head under the covers to drown out the screams of your baby sister? Your 6-year-old sister that your daddy raped? Night after night?
Even virtually impossible examples of child abuse by men are discussed and broadcast with fervour.
Let us say it is somebody who is raped by a sex pervert. Let us say that it's a young woman who is raped by her father. This woman should not, or this child, well, she wouldn't be a child. You can only get this if you're over 18.
Businesses like the NSPCC and Oxfam trade on the negative perception of men, rather than what they know to be the reality. Some children and babies are battered to death by their mothers, or burnt with boiling water or cigarettes. Some mothers deliberately poison their children, typically with bleach or rat poison. Some babies are shaken by their mothers until their necks snap. Some babies are suffocated, stabbed, neglected, or starved to death. But when mothers kill their babies, it's not called murder, it's called infanticide. Only a woman can kill her baby, claim to be suffering some kind of syndrome, and escape prison. In fact, women seem to be afflicted by numerous syndromes, all of which allow them to kill in cold blood and be considered blameless. Battered woman syndrome, premenstrual syndrome, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, whatever the crime, there's a female-only defence using some kind of syndrome.
Hey, Lois, look at me. I got postpartum depression. Wah! I'm sad about stuff. Wah!